Hey guys, it's Dani. Today we are talking about one of the orchids you guys requested a lot recently, and this is the Maxillaria tenuifolia that you see over there. This is actually where I'm keeping it and where we're gonna film most of the video of today, which is a bit of a change, but I'm hoping a welcomed one. So we're gonna do a basic care tips type of video, nothing super advanced. I'm gonna tell you how to properly care for this orchid in a home environment, tell you a little bit more about the growth pattern and why this orchid is so popular. Because if you didn't know, this is also called the coconut orchid, and it's not because it grows on coconuts. So with that said, let's start with the growth pattern and getting to know this orchid better before we move on to culture tips. The Maxillaria tenuifolia, also known as the coconut orchid, is a species found in Mexico, Costa Rica, and a few other places around the globe. You will have down below linked the orchid species website so you know more about its habitat, which is a perfect orchid to grow in the house because it is actually a worm grower. If you do visit the website, you will see that they actually forgot to say warm to cool growing orchid. That's just a typo. Grammar mistakes, sadly, are part of the orchid species website, which is unfortunate, but it is not a cool growing orchid. So if you are getting your information solely from there, don't. This is an orchid that comes from lower elevations where temperatures are typically higher. And from my experience, I can tell you that it can absolutely tolerate the cooler, let's say, temperatures in my growing space in the winter, as well as the super hot and prolonged summers that I have. I personally don't grow it outside. I enjoy it more in the greenhouse. I reserve my space for the cattleyas, but I do know other people growing it outside in warm to hot climates without any type of problem. As you might have guessed by the presence of the pseudobulbs, this is a sympodial orchid. It produces pseudobulbs connected through a rhizome, but the pattern of growth is really interesting, pretty unique in my opinion, as this orchid tends to have a climbing habit and grows more on a vertical than on a horizontal. However, it's not that annoying climbing habit that sometimes some oncidium type orchids have. So you will not actually run out of space in the pot necessarily. You can still keep an orchid like this pretty tidy if you use a ring support, or you can just let it grow slightly pendant. It will kind of arch under its own weight, but it makes for a really beautiful display. Mine is not a very big specimen. I am growing it out, but if you Google her name, you will see tons of pictures on the internet with bigger specimens and how beautiful they can be. But as you can see at the base, let's call it a trunk, it's not a very correct term, but for the sake of conversation, the trunk is really not that large. So most of the pseudobulbs are produced upwards on top of each other, and they are connected through a rhizome covered in sheaths. You might wonder what's happening with the new roots, because with this orchid, as well as with other sympodials, most of the new roots start from the newest growth. Well, what happens is they actually travel through the sheaths that cover the rhizome, and many of them make their way to the pot. So even if this orchid tends to be a climber, the pot can still be full of roots. To get a better idea of its growth pattern, just imagine an oncidium orchid which produces its pseudobulbs on top of each other rather than next to each other. And hey presto, you have the Maxillaria tenuifolia. On the top of each pseudobulb, we have one single leaf, which is super thin and long, and this gives it a super beautiful grassy aspect to it that I absolutely adore. I love seeing this orchid even when it's not in bloom, and the more mature it is, the better the grassy display. I am also a fan of the pseudobulbs, which are oval and have a really aesthetical symmetry, in my opinion. They are plump and glossy and have a beautiful medium green shade. This orchid typically blooms once a year in the springtime, whenever spring might be for you, and it produces one single flower per flower spike. We talked about this in the flower spike or not video, but I'll mention it here again so we have a better picture of this orchid. Flower spikes can come from either side of each pseudobulb, but unlike most other sympodial orchids, not right next to the pseudobulb. Between the first sheath, let's say, and the pseudobulb, typically we have a new growth, which will mature into a new pseudobulb. Below this new growth is where the buds form, and each pseudobulb can produce between 1 to 3, maybe even 4 buds. New pseudobulbs are most likely to bloom, but I do have a few blooms that are coming from older pseudobulbs as well. It doesn't have the habit of creating multiple flowers from the very same location though. The flowers have a very typical Maxillaria shape. If you are acquainted with Maxillarias, I do find that they all look pretty similar between them. And one thing that I noticed with most of them is that the actual petals don't seem to open completely. When you look at the flower, it's the sepals that you are seeing wide open, and of course the lip. But the actual petals seem to be rather closed. The flowers are not big, but they're very, very cute. They are a red-brown color, and the lip tends to have these really nice brown specks on a yellow background, and there appears to be quite a little bit of variety when it comes to the actual shade, to the exact pattern on the sepals and petals. You can see mine has quite a few lighter colored specks on the sepals, which in my opinion makes it a little bit more interesting. But the actual coloration and shape of the flowers are not the main attraction of this orchid. The fragrance is. And here is where that whole coconut orchid thing comes into play. This orchid smells like coconuts, or at least this seems to be the consensus. But as detecting fragrance tends to be a rather personal thing, we all tend to have a different opinion when it comes to the actual fragrance. I think I can see why the resemblance with coconuts, but to me it smells a little bit more like peaches, or maybe a little bit like pineapple. One of you guys mentioned that you feel like it has a very tropical scent, but not necessarily coconuts. But I think the vast majority of you guys will detect coconut. So if you're a fan of that, then there you have it. This is your orchid. If not, it just has a beautiful tropical indeed fragrance that is not super powerful, but it is very, very noticeable. And in a small room when the sun is bright and the temperature is warm, you can definitely detect this beautiful fragrance in the air. And it's really, really fresh. It's not overly sweet, not overly sour. It is indeed one of the best smelling orchids that I have, even though I don't detect necessarily coconuts, maybe a little bit of hint of it, but peaches or some tropical fruit cocktail, oh yes, I can definitely detect that. And this is the second Maxillaria that I smell, and both of them smelled identical, so I don't think it's the case only with this one. I think it's just how I perceive the fragrance, but I do still enjoy it. Now that we got to know this orchid a little bit better, let's talk about care. So first of all, light. And this is part of the reason why I decided to film this video here, so you can see exactly the amount of light, visually at least, that I give to this orchid. This is a highlight orchid. It prefers Cattleya type light or even Vanda type light. But of course, like any other orchid, do make sure that the leaves don't overheat because they can burn. So very hot, direct noon sun, maybe not the best idea for this orchid, but other than that, it really enjoys early morning sun, late afternoon sun, and if you can provide some sheltering like a sheer curtain or things of the sorts, that's even better. This is my southern exposure window and my setup here. This is where I keep my highest light orchids and where I keep Maxillaria as well. In very low light conditions, I doubt that it will bloom, or if it does, not so profusely. And when it comes to artificial light, I honestly did not try it with this orchid because it is notorious for liking high amounts of light. So I decided to just go for bright natural light. But if you do intend to use artificial light, do make sure that it is bright enough for it. Temperature-wise, as we discussed at the beginning of the video, it is a very, very tolerant orchid, but it does have a bias towards the warm side of the spectrum. In wintertime, it really doesn't do way too much for me. It matures its pseudobulbs, but it is in spring when temperatures warm up when this orchid comes alive. New growth is created, I see new root tips growing, and of course, blooming starts. The temperature in my grow room is comfortable to me. It's a maximum of 28 degrees Celsius during summertime and 23-24 the rest of the year, minus a month or two in the winter when it gets a little bit colder to 18 degrees Celsius. Humidity, I will just skip altogether because this orchid does not care. It cannot be bothered. It is so adapted to withstand dry conditions that there is no point in mentioning ideals or anything of the sorts. Whatever you have in your home, it will do okay with. However, it absolutely loves water via the root system, which is one of the main aspects in the culture of a Maxillaria tenuifolia. It absolutely hates, but hates with a passion, drying out. So most of the times I do leave this orchid in a little bit of a pool of water because I cannot really cope with its demands, and especially when it is in bloom, it seems to need even more water than usual. You can see some of the older pseudobulbs on mine are just a little bit wrinkly, and I've noticed them to be this way ever since this orchid bloomed. And it makes sense. It's putting a lot of energy into those flowers, and I make sure to keep it constantly moist. I can usually get away with it drying out a little bit in the winter, spring and autumn, but in the summertime, no, I have to keep it constantly super wet at a root level. Otherwise, it will be very upset with me. And this is another very notorious trait of the Maxillaria tenuifolia. Even though it is tolerant to drought, it will not look good. If your Maxillaria tenuifolia will not receive water for 2-3 weeks a month, it will still be alive because those pseudobulbs store water, and it can sprout back because it is a resilient orchid. But trust me, it will not look good if you try to keep it way too dry. In my opinion, the two most important cultural factors for it are light and water. Let's talk about fertilizer as well. I just fertilize it together with my other orchids, nothing special in particular for it. She's not a light feeder, but not a very heavy feeder either. So for me, she's mostly on the oncidium schedule of fertilizer, which just happens to be whatever the bottle of fertilizer says. So I don't add extra, I don't subtract. It's doing okay with the standard quotation marks dosage. Since it is such a heavy drinker and my environment is rather warm, I do prefer to keep it in a bark and sphagnum moss mix, which has at least 50% sphagnum moss. And in this way, I can actually cope with its watering demands. It drinks water super fast. And of course, the bigger the orchid is, the bigger the demand will be. But of course, you should adjust this to your environment. If you have a very humid environment, or maybe one that is not so hot, or with such prolonged summers as mine, I think you can get away with bark no problem. But if you feel like you have to water your Maxillaria way too often, then I do suggest you give sphagnum moss a try. And speaking about potting media, mine could use a good repot, which I shall do when the flowers are over, because as you can see, roots are growing all over the place. They keep drying out outside of the pot, and the pot is full of roots. Also, the orchid is drying out a little bit too fast for my liking, so I might take you along in a different video for repotting. If you're interested in it, let me know down below in the comment section. But as you can see, the pot that I use also has quite a lot of ventilation, and this is because it's an epiphytic orchid, so it still enjoys air, and it can still be prone to root rot and suffocation of the roots if you make the medium way too compact and you limit air circulation too much. So with this orchid, I would go for a lot of air and a lot of water at the same time if possible, and everything should be just fine. And as a little side note, the roots are naturally a little yellow-brown on this orchid. It's a trait that some other Maxillarias have. And as an example, here is my Maxillaria variabilis, which is just as thirsty as this one, but I think I can get away with this pot for another year. But if you can see, the roots do have this yellowish color, which is absolutely normal, and I did see it on other Maxillarias as well. Some of them have pretty brown roots, some pretty yellow roots. Overall, I find the Maxillaria tenuifolia super easy to care for, very suited for home conditions. You don't need a greenhouse to take care of this orchid. It should do absolutely okay if you have quite a bit of light and the availability to offer it water. Other than that, she's just like any other epiphytic orchid, very resilient and willing to put on new roots in case it remains rootless for whatever reason, which can happen. So if you're a beginner looking to expand your collection to some orchid species rather than man-made hybrids or the typical Phalaenopsis, I highly recommend this orchid, particularly for its fragrance, ease of care, but also because it looks super good as a houseplant even when it's not in bloom, which is pretty much most of the times, sadly. Blooms though can last for about a month or so. Mine has been in bloom for the past 2 or 3 weeks, And you can see I still have a little bud developing here, so this will extend the total blooming time to about a month, most probably. But I personally do enjoy this orchid for the aesthetics as well. It has the wow factor for me, and I cannot wait for it to grow larger into a specimen size. I do believe I will have to address the potting style at some point. Maybe I would like to keep it hanging somehow so that all of these leaves start to hang around the plant. But I guess we'll see when we get there, probably in 3 or 4 years. But I hope you can see that it can actually be a little bit versatile. And if you've ever had a spider plant, well, this is the orchid equivalent of that, in my opinion, minus the little baby plantlets. So that's about it on the Maxillaria tenuifolia, but before I let you go, I want to see if it is Joey approved. Do you like it, Joe? You like it? It's really beautiful, isn't it? I'm taking this opportunity in showing off Joey because Joey is the shy bird. She doesn't really appear in my videos, partly due to her shyness, but also partly due to the incubation schedule. Since this is afternoon, this is her time off. Maya is on the nest and she's free to fly around the greenhouse. So with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you have a great day and a lovely weekend. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!